Researchers set out to do something remarkably direct: line up the DNA of Black Americans against every major population group on the planet: Asian European, Latino, Indigenous, South Asian, Middle Eastern. The results didn't just add a footnote to history, they forced a reconsideration of it, not because of what the data said about one group in isolation, but because of what it exposed about human ancestry as a whole, about what centuries of enslavement actually did to a population's genetic makeup in ways that had never been fully measured. This isn't really a story about race. It's a story about deep time survival and what may be the most genetically intricate population on Earth. Geneticists have quietly wrestled with a single question for years in journals and conference rooms, often without saying the full implications out loud. If you take a group whose ancestors were forcibly removed from their homeland, stripped of names, languages, and family lineage, and then compare their DNA to every other population on the planet, what actually shows up? What does a genome say once the paper trail has been destroyed? When researchers finally ran that comparison at scale, the answer surprised even seasoned SC to understand why it helps to know something. Most people never learned in school human genetic variation isn't a flat plane, it's more like a mountain range. Some populations are relatively uniform genetically, others contain so much internal variation that two people from the same ethnic group can differ from each other more than a European differs from an East Asian. Africa sits at the extreme end of that range, and it isn't close. Oxford's genetics researchers have found that genetic diversity within Africa outstrips everything found outside it, largely because modern humans have lived there for roughly 300,000 years. Every population elsewhere on Earth descends from a small subset that left the continent, carrying only a slice of Africa's full genetic range in effect. Every non-African population is a partial sample of a much larger original library. That's just the starting point. The entists. When scientists turned specifically to the DNA of Black Americans, descendants of enslaved people brought to the U.S., they found a genetic profile shaped not by voluntary migration or trade, but by generations of systemic violence. Large genomic studies of nearly 4,000 Black Americans estimate that roughly 82 of ancestry traces to Africa before the transatlantic slave trade, about 17 to Europe, and just over 1 to the Americas. Those numbers look clinical on paper, but their real meaning is harder to sit with. That European ancestry isn't the product of immigration or cultural blending. It exists because enslaved Black women had no legal control over their own bodies for more than 2 centuries in this country. Historian Henry Louis Gates Juris cited research suggesting that around 35 of African American men can trace descent from a white male ancestor who fathered a child during the era of slavery in most cases, through rape or coercion. That's not an abstract historical fact. It's biology carried forward into tens of millions of living people today. And when scientists compared this ancestry against other global populations, they didn't find a simplified or diminished genetic picture. They found the opposite. Layering centuries of forced mixing onto an already unmatched West African genetic foundation produced something scientifically remarkable: extraordinary genomic complexity. Research from teams at the University of Pennsylvania and Cornell, published in PNAS, found that genetic diversity among African and African American populations was far more intricate than previously assumed, shaped by deep historical, cultural, and linguistic forces. In plain terms, Black Americans aren't genetically simple. Their genomes function like a compressed record of multiple continents and centuries, folded into one geneticist Sarah Tishkoff's landmark. Studies of African populations found more genetic variation there than anywhere else on Earth, a natural consequence of humanity's long tenure on the continent. Combine that foundation with generations of forced reproduction, the Great Migration, regional isolation disease, and the brutal selection pressures of enslavement, and you get a population that doesn't fit neatly into any single genetic bucket. There are real geographic patterns. Black Americans in the South average around 83 African ancestry versus roughly 80 elsewhere in the country. But individual variation swamps the averages. Some people carry 95 African ancestry. Others carry 40 European ancestry. Many carry detectable Indigenous American ancestry from communities that overlapped through shared displacement and enslavement. No other self-identified ethnic group in the U.S. shows this much internal genetic range. This challenges a common but flawed assumption that racial labels map cleanly onto genetic clusters. A large study published in Science found wide variation in African and European ancestry proportions among people identifying as Black or African American, with even greater complexity among those who identified as Hispanic or Latino, whose DNA often reflected a blend of African European and Indigenous ancestry. Race, in short, is a social construct. Genetics tells a different, messier story. This isn't just an academic curiosity. It has direct consequences for healthcare studies of ADME genes. The ones governing how the body processes drugs show significantly more diversity in African American populations than in the reference populations. Drug trials are usually built around most pharmaceutical dosing, and safety standards were calibrated primarily on European genetic baselines, not on the far more complex genetic architecture many Black Americans carry. That mismatch has real consequences. Unexplained variation in how people respond to medication and health disparities that have puzzled the medical field for decades may trace in part to this genetic reality. There's also a structural problem. Because slavery destroyed genealogical records, many Black Americans face what researchers call a brick wall in tracing ancestry through conventional means, right as medicine moves toward genetically personalized care. Without that ancestral detail, valuable genetic information risks staying locked out of reach of the systems meant to use it. This is where recent developments matter. In November 2025, 23andMe's Research Institute announced an expansion of its ancestry tools, adding more than 250 high-resolution African genetic groupings, the most detailed commercial ancestry mapping of the continent to date. Over 80 of Black and African American customers on the newest platform now match to at least one of these groups, giving many people their first concrete lead into ancestral origins that slavery had erased: Yoruba, Igbo, Mende, Congo, Fante Mandinka, and others. Set against the genetic profiles of every other population on Earth, the picture that emerges runs counter to the narrative long used to justify racial hierarchy. Rather than being genetically simple, Black Americans carry some of the deepest, most layered ancestral diversity of any population, not by choice, but as a consequence of both an already rich African genetic foundation and everything imposed on top of it. Despite this complexity, Black Americans remain significantly underrepresented in genetic research databases, a gap that mirrors broader patterns of underrepresentation across many institutions. As precision medicine advances, the population that could benefit most from ancestry-informed care is also the population with the least genetic data driving that care forward. The implications reach beyond one population. A major 2025 genetic analysis challenged the long-standing idea that modern humans emerged from a single ancestral group in Africa, suggesting instead that early humans evolved from multiple loosely connected populations, exchanging genes for tens of thousands of years before fully diverging. That doesn't diminish Africa's role as humanity's origin, it deepens it, describing something more like a networked multi-population process, unfolding over hundreds of thousands of years. The populations whose DNA still carries the clearest signature of that deep history are African populations and their descendants, including the roughly 45 million Black Americans living in the U.S. today, whose genomes layer that ancient depth with the added history of the transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly transported an estimated 7 million Africans between 1501 and 1866, roughly 400,000 of whom arrived in what became the United States. Recent research from 23andMe, in partnership with Johns Hopkins and the NIH, and drawing on data from 4 million participants, found that sickle cell trait disproportionately present in people of African descent raises pulmonary embolism risk through a clotting mechanism different from what was previously assumed. That finding has real clinical stakes. Treatment protocols built without this understanding may not be well suited to Black patients. More broadly, this line of research touches something larger than genetics alone. It's about who has historically had access to ancestral knowledge and who has been denied it. Most other American ethnic groups can trace lineage through documented records, oral histories, or preserved cultural memory. Enslavement was designed specifically to prevent that continuity for Black Americans, severing names, languages, and family lines as a matter of policy. What emerging genomic science suggests is that this information didn't disappear. It persisted in the genome itself through the Middle Passage plantation, slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, and everything. After, only now does the technology exist to begin reading it. The open questions about reparations, identity, healthcare equity, and historical memory are only beginning to be asked in light of what this research reveals. The data itself simply shows a population whose genetic inheritance is among the deepest and most complex documented in human genetics, not despite its history, but because of it,